welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Obama's legacy as the U.S. president finishes what is likely his last tour in Europe. We'll examine his global legacy through the lens of Europe's cooled affections for a man who at the beginning of his office roused the screaming crowds. And meet Jia. China unveils its first human-like robot who may soon be capable of deep learning. What are the ethical considerations? We begin today's show with the U.S. president's trip to the Middle East and Europe. President Barack Obama spent the past 6 days visiting his political allies, spending considerable political capital on issues close to their hearts. With 9 months left in the office, we take a look at his foreign policy legacy in both regions. Take a look.
It's likely the last trip of his presidency to this region. U.S. President Barack Obama has concluded a 6-day trip to the Middle East and Europe, where he sought to shore up U.S. alliances he views as key to growing trade, defeating Islamic State militants, and offsetting Russian aggression in Ukraine and Syria. But the trip also highlighted Obama's concerns about the shaky global economy and the ripple effects of the conflict in Syria, priorities he wants to work on before his term ends next January.
And my goal between now and the time I leave is to make sure that when I turn over the keys to my office, that the desk is clean, and if the world is not completely tidy, that at least it's significantly better off than the way I found it.
Obama can certainly claim some foreign policy achievements. During remarks in a town hall with young leaders of the UK, he said he is proud of saving the world economy from a Great Depression, and his work to get possible nuclear weapons out of Iran. Meanwhile, he also restored diplomatic relations with Cuba after more than half a century, and largely made good on 2008 promises to get American troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan. However, the president's policy on the Middle East has also garnered criticism. The U.S. military has led an air campaign against the Islamic State since 2014 in Iraq and Syria. And in a speech on Monday, Obama announced that 250 more American soldiers are heading to Syria, including special forces, to provide what he called momentum in the fight against ISIL, just hours after calling ground troops in Syria a mistake.
It would be a mistake for the United States or Great Britain or a combination of Western states to send in ground troops.
Obama's latest foreign policy moves involve more military action in the Middle East, a reboot with South America, seeking to realign with Europe, and further action on the U.S.'s supposed pivot to Asia. It's a complicated approach, and the world awaits to see whether President Obama will truly clear his desk in the next 9 months.
And for more on Obama's trip to Europe and his foreign legacy in that regard, we are now joined in Brussels by Mr. Paul Ivan, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. Meanwhile, in London, we are having Mr. Lucas Kulesa, I hope I pronounced your name right, sir. And he is the Research Director with the European Leadership Network. Thank you very much, sir. And also in Washington, joining us, we are having Mr. Bülent Ali-Reza, Director and Senior Associate with the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Firstly, how much light does President Obama still have with the Europeans? How is that compared to 2008 when he made a similar speech and a similar trip to Germany? Mr. Ivan.
Well, it's clear that some of that very high popularity that Obama registered at the beginning of his term, and actually even before becoming U.S. president, has been a bit unrealistic. So I think it was only natural for him to lose some of that popularity in Europe and to get to more, let's say, more realistic levels.
But on the other hand, how much has Europe really lost in terms of its own confidence moving forward? Is President Obama providing much inspiration this time? Mr. Kulesa?
Well, I would still say that at the personal level, he still works his magic quite well. If you listen to his speeches in the UK, in Germany, it is amazing how he can interact with the audience. I would agree that indeed there is some fatigue after such a long time, and especially now we know that the world cannot be changed as fast and as dramatic in a positive way as President Obama and the Europeans hope in 2008. But it's interesting that his message in Europe is that he's much more pro-European than many of the Europeans right now.
Mr. Ali Reza, many suggest that 8 years ago when President Obama was making a similar trip to Germany and delivered a similar speech supporting the German Chancellor and also the Europeans, it was a time when the Europeans were struggling with some of the important issues, but now people are suggesting the Europeans are struggling with the existential issues, the issues related to their existence. Do you think that's the right comparison?
Well, when Mr. Obama came into power, one of the arguments that people were making was that he was not a natural Atlanticist, that he did not come from the long line of American leaders, American presidents who believed in the importance, in the vital importance of the relationship with Western Europe. In fact, people called him the first Pacific president. There's been a great deal of discussion about his pivot to Asia. Nonetheless, at the very end of his trip, he's making this trip to Europe, where he's encouraging the Europeans to stay together. He's to believe in the goal of European unity and arguing against the British exit, and trying to help with issues like the refugee crisis that Europe is grappling with. How much of an influence he has on Europe, which, as you say, is dealing with existential issues, I'm not sure, because we're, as you said at the beginning, we're almost at the end of his presidency, and although he's a great orator, you know, people accuse him of trying to govern by speeches, good speeches that his aides write for him, but the impact, you know, there are more questions than answers when it comes to that.
How much weight does it really carry, his speech and his opinions? Mr. Kulesa, from the President Obama to the Europeans, is he still can carry certain weight, and how much will that mean for a European continent struggling with some of the very important existential, as I said earlier, using this adjective, issues?
Well, there is one specific issue, which is the discussion about UK's membership in the European Union. And as you know, there is a referendum coming in the United Kingdom. So in that way, it was very important for President Obama to come to London and to say very explicitly that he and, in extension, the United States would prefer the UK to stay within the European Union. Several commentators are saying that it can have an impact on the minds of the people here. On the more general questions of the future of Europe, he's making the right noises. He's saying that the United States needs Europe as a partner, but I would agree with my colleagues that his message as a person leaving the office is somehow less important than the position of the next US president.
Right. Mr. Ivan, though, when you look at the challenges of the Europeans, you got, of course, the EU's existence and what does that mean, whether countries want to withdraw it or remain as a unity. You also got the economic issues going on inside the European continent, and also Russia's challenge as many Europeans see it. And meanwhile, there is migration problems and also domestic jihadis. So how much does the U.S. have a role in terms of the Europeans handling all of these quite pretty much domestic challenges? Is the Obama administration successful in its way and strategies of handling with transatlantic relations over the past 8 years?
Well, I would say it's very clear that the European Union facing a number of challenges, and you name them. But I would not say that it's an existential crisis in the sense that the EU might disappear. I don't think that's likely to happen, and I don't think that's really the prospects we're looking at. I mean, yes, it's true, the referendum in the United Kingdom would be very important, but even in a worst-case scenario in which the United Kingdom would leave the Union would continue. I mean, a weakened Union, but certainly will certainly continue. Now, for many of these challenges, cooperation with its allies and with the United States in particular is very important. I mean, if we look at the fight against Daesh, against the Islamic State, if we look at the challenges coming from Russia in Ukraine, but also in terms of cooperation against the terrorist threat, it's very clear that there's a lot of ground that the two sides of the Atlantic have to work on and do work on. For many, I mean, countries in Europe, and for the NATO countries in Europe, the US is their main ally, their main security ally, and American presence and cooperation is seen as crucial.
Mr. Ali Reza, though, what about your assessment? The transatlantic strategy of the Obama administration over the past 8 years, has it helped Europe? Has it helped this transatlantic relationship, which used to be the pillar?
I don't think so. I don't think that the transatlantic relationship today is as strong as it was in 2008. And I think it's much more of a transactional relationship than an ideological bonding of the kind that we had beginning immediately after the Second World War against the Soviet threat that continued for decades. What is interesting is that, for example, the Daesh, ISIS threat and the related issue within Syria itself, and the related issue of terrorism in Western Europe with the jihadis coming back to carry out terrorist actions. Now, obviously, the US wants to engage the Europeans on this issue. The Europeans absolutely need to engage the US with its massive counterterrorism capabilities. But that's a transactional relationship. And it actually, in addition to dragging Obama back into a closer relationship with Europe, perhaps closer than he would want. He would prefer, for example, to focus on China and Asia, as he said, but also to focus on the Middle East, from which he's been trying to disengage. And yet here he is sending additional troops into Syria and Iraq, and the fight against Daesh and terrorism involves a closer transatlantic relationship.
Mr. Kuleza, is that relationship, as described by Ali Reza, Mr. Ali Reza, also the same nature to you?
Well, I wouldn't call it just transactional, because that might be a way to describe the relations with China, and on some issues maybe the relations with Russia, whereas the transatlantic relations, I think, go deeper. There is still a unity which is connected with the joint history, with the same general set of values that bring together most of the European countries and the United States. And especially right now that we are jointly challenged by the developments in the Middle East and the developments in Russia. I think for many people in Europe, we see how close we are to the United States and vice versa. And I would just like to underline that the United States and its armed forces are actually physically present in the number of locations in Europe. So this is not just a symbolic relationship, but this is an actual a joint commitment to the security of Europe.
We see a tendency over there. It seems that the European counterparts in our discussion tend to emphasize more on this transatlantic relations and how it remains the same. Well, we'll proceed as always, but rather Mr. Ali Reza, coming now from the US and based there, seem to brush it off a little bit. Mr. Ali Reza, what about the President Obama's comment during his speech in Germany about the Europeans relying too much when it comes to defense on the others, not on ourselves?
I remember that interview that he gave where he was talking about free riders taking advantage of the U.S.'s ability and willingness to take the main load on so many issues, particularly security issues. He's been pressing the Europeans, the European members of NATO, to spend more on defense. And you know what Obama is saying, the likely Republican candidate for President Trump is saying with a much louder voice. He's been arguing, questioning the NATO membership. He's been arguing against the reliance by other allies on the United States. So I think the Europeans had better get used to this kind of criticism at a much higher decibel, because there is a real discussion in the United States as we proceed to the elections, and Obama is reflecting this about what exactly these alliances are, why these alliances are important for the U.S. or not.
Right, Mr. Yuan, it seems last time when we were talking, you were very angry with Mr. Trump's remarks regarding the transatlantic relations, but as Mr. Ali Reza indicated earlier, this time President Obama seems to also emphasize certain element of that sentiment going on inside the United States. Has the Europeans received that message, or Europeans rather like to ignore it because anyway you would not be able to solve that problem, defense problem, by now on your own?
Well, I wouldn't say I was angry with his statements. I just don't agree with them. It's clear that we've been hearing this sort of criticism from the other side of the Atlantic for some years, and at the same time, it's very clear that defense budgets are rising in Europe due to these multiple security challenges that we've seen. And I think the discourse coming from the other side of the Atlantic is already adjusting to this very clear decisions that are taken in Europe to strengthen defense budgets and to raise them. So I expect actually this sort of tension really to level out in the next months and years.
Will it, Mr. Ali Reza, very briefly from you?
I don't agree with that. I think there isn't an isolationist threat per se coming from the United States. The U.S. will still engage with its allies. It's an indispensable superpower with a web of alignments with countries. Nonetheless, the American electorate are very angry, and Obama himself reacted to that anger by withdrawing from Iraq, planning to withdraw from Afghanistan, refraining from introducing troops into Syria and Iraq for a very long time, and at the same time questioning the alliances, not just with the Europeans, but also traditional allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I'm afraid for the foreseeable future, this kind of tension is going to continue.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Obama, at the very beginning of his presidency...
Time, if I may just...
Very briefly, if you can, sir.
Yeah, very briefly. At the same time, the U.S. has quadrupled its defense budget in Europe. So we see a 4-time increase of the U.S. defense budget in Europe. So it's clearly there was a wish to end the wars in the Middle East, but at the same time, President Obama and U.S. administration, I think, are very realistic about the challenges that the alliance is faced with.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of debates going on about that. It is not only about Europe's role in today's world and how the Americans see it, about the transatlantic relations. It's also about how the American presidency, what role it has done in terms of its transatlantic partnership. President Obama set very high standards at the very beginning of his term. He ran for the election in 2007 and 2008, promising to mend the West breach with the Islamic world, to repair the nation's image abroad, reset relations with Russia, move toward a world free of nuclear weapons, avoid stupid wars while winning the right war, and also combat climate change. He ran for the re-election in 2012 with the additional pledges of ending the nation's wars and completing the dissemination of Al-Qaeda and many other things. These are words he said, and we remember them. But at the end of this term, he's coming to Europe, having a tour. How would the Europeans eventually assess his performance. After all, the U.S. is the most powerful nation in the world. Its presidency is not only going to be assessed domestically, but also by international citizens. So Mr. Kulesa, what do you say?
Well, it will be a mixed picture, and I hope some of the achievements of this administration will last, because we talk about Iran, where you had a long diplomacy, a long diplomatic track, a great example of cooperation, including Europeans who were persuaded to introduce quite painful sanctions towards Iran. So you had Iran, you had Cuba, a number of other initial achievements that we hope would not be ruined by the next US president. But you also had the reality catching up with these big plans. So the United States was very much in a reactive mode after the Arab Spring, after the Syrian war started, and also when the Russians invaded Ukraine. So therefore, instead of having the big plans to implement, this administration had to react. And therefore, we don't see that many achievements as maybe we thought in 2008, 2009.
Before we go, I also want to briefly invite some opinions from the other two gentlemen. One sentence or two, your assessment so far of the U.S. presidency. Mr. Yuan.
If I may, I would agree that well, the results are mixed, clearly, and I think it's also to be expected, let's say, that the goals that one puts at the beginning of one's administration would not be fully achieved. It also shows us the limits of the power, even of the most powerful nation in the world.
Well, we are all realists. We're not saying whatever he promised will be carried out eventually at the end of the presidency. But what do you say, Mr. Ali Reza? Only sporadic success, for example, Cuba and Iran. What about overall speaking?
Well, you know, we're now in the final months of the presidency, and what is clear is that in spite of the immense powers vested in the presidency, some call it the imperial presidency, his ability to shape events either outside the United States or even within the United States are limited. And I think as he comes to the end of his term in office, Mr. Obama's stated desire, as you reported earlier, to clean his desk is going to be you know, frustrated by events inside the country as well as outside. So I think that he may, in some senses, he'll leave a frustrated man, and in some senses he will sense a degree of achievement that is always the case with departing presidents.
Okay. Well, we'll see what kind of legacy he has achieved and what kind of table is he going to lift when he cleans the desk after all. Thank you so much for the three of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Bülent Ali Reza, Lucas Kulesa, and also Paul Yuan. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Let's meet Jia, China's first human-like robot. Could the advancement of the robotics impact the economy or even the Chinese society? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. With a series of supporting policies from the central government here in China, the robot industry has developed rapidly in this country in the past few years. On April the 6th, the Ministry of Industry, the Development and Reform Commission, and the Ministry of Finance jointly issued a development plan for the industry in the coming 5 years. The plan rolls out the industry's 5 tasks, including breakthroughs on key products and key components, significantly improving the quality of robot reliability, market share, and leading enterprises' competitiveness. The country expects that by 2020, the number of industrial robots sold will reach 150,000, with a total of 800,000 robots in use. China also expects the overall industrial robot output value to break 100 billion yuan, or over 15 billion US dollars, at the end of the year 2020. Now, newly released human-like robots from the USTC team are in the spotlight in this country. Before we go deep into our discussion of our human-like robot, let's have a look at this.
你好。
您好，主人，有什么需要我帮助的吗？
Meet Jiajia, a new human-like robot. A research and development team from China University of Science and Technology unveiled this new generation of interactive robots last week. Jiajia can blink its eyes, nod, move its hands, and even carry on conversations.
这样的机器人
The robots can be used to serve people in public places, including banks, malls, business offices, and science and technology museums. They can also accompany elders. Interactions between robots and humans will usher in a new phase. Robots will not only be able to have simple chats with customers, but also engage in emotional communication.
The global industry has developed various robots aimed at different fields. Robots for entertainment, like Jiajia, only comprise a small part. In recent years, a series of government policies supporting the robot industry have prompted a boom in China's robot companies and technology development. Various robotics technology fairs have been held. Meanwhile, since 2013, China has been the world's biggest robot market, accounting for 40% of the global robot market. Annual robot sales in China will jump from 57,000 in 2014 to 150,000 by 2018, experts say. That's almost a triple increase. However, China's robot companies own less than 30% of the domestic market. More than half of China's robot market belongs to the big four robot companies. All of them are foreign companies. Most of China's robot companies focus on low-end products, and the industry relies heavily on imported core robot components. However, experts say that China's robot industry is becoming ever more advanced.
And for more on this topic, we're joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Yu Kai, who is founder and CEO of Horizon Robotics. That's a Beijing-based startup researching and developing artificial intelligence and robotics here in China. Welcome to our program, sir.
Thank you.
And also joining us from Tokyo, we have William Saito, who is a special advisor to the Japanese cabinet and founder of Indicur, an international technology consulting and advisory firm. Meanwhile, in the U.S., we are joined by Mr. Chao Huigong in Pittsburgh. He is a project scientist of the Robotics Institute at the Carnegie Mellon University. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Great to have you on this wonderful topic. What do you make of that human-like Jiajia that we have shown in our background? Supposed to be a beautiful lady, at least in the eyes of those in the science major coming from China. Mr. Yu, what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's certainly a great piece of work, and Jiajia is really human-like, and also as far as I can see, it has this capacity of interaction with people, which is very smart. Yeah.
Okay, she can talk, of course.
She can talk, interact with
and
people.
Her lips moves with the sync.
Yeah.
And also she could measure her surroundings. For example, if somebody is taking a photo of her, if that person is getting quite close, she would say, well, not too close to me, otherwise my face look big. Like a typical girl in China who would say the same thing. But how advanced really is it? Mr. Gong, I know you've been doing a lot of research about the robots and also including the Chinese counterparts' work. What do you make of the advanced level and sophistication of this human-like robot?
Yes, so I think human-like robot requires a lot of technology in terms of artificial intelligence, natural language processing capabilities. And indeed, as seen from Jiajia robot, we can see at least in terms of natural language processing, it has reached a new level which we have never seen before.
But what about the sophistication? What do you mean by you have never seen before? How sophisticated really is it? Would you like to describe it rather just let us guess? Mr. Gong.
Yes, so first of all, it requires a lot of hardware implementation. It needs to receive the voice signals from human beings, for example, through a microphone. Second, once it receives all these digital signals, it needs to translate them into human understandable context. Like, for example, what's the command, what's the intent of the human being who is interacting with the robot. And later, it needs to think about what's the expected output from this robot so that it can satisfy the human intention or human need. So this involves a lot of computation, a lot of signal processing, which altogether makes up the capability of this Jaja robot we see here.
Sounds fascinating with that explanation. Mr. Saito, of course, China is not the first one to develop a humanoid robot. Japan and the United States, many other European countries have done so as well. What do you say about this sophistication?
No, I think it's a great advancement, and it shows that robotics has come a long ways. I'm glad that at the introduction it was classified as an entertainment robot. So, all robots are kind of the same in the sense that they take sensor input, they move an actuator, they perform some sort of output. And so I think the innovation that you see there is these things all happening simultaneously. But it's always going to be interesting to see how these things get defined and become actual products in the market, because that's always the hard part.
I want you to go a little bit more specific, and I want to give you an example. There was a famous humanoid robot developed by Japan back in the year 2010, which is called Humanoid, if I pronounce it right. It was developed with the appearance of a 20-year-old girl and can make over 60 kinds of facial expressions, including blinking eyes, smiling, and frowning. It even acted on stage with other human actors, but critics say its technological capabilities were not satisfying and it didn't look realistically human. We also, of course, been hearing news stories coming from Japan, have been shown at recent technological fairs, the new humanoid robot being developed. Mr. Saito, how far are we from one another? I mean, as far as you can tell, from Japan's and also from China's.
Yeah, so when I discuss these topics like robotics, it's always very important to talk about what the end goal is. To actually create a very humanoid-like robot is actually very, very difficult. To be human is actually to make mistakes. For example, your eye movement, it's something called hippus, where you have these involuntary movements that you kind of make by mistake that really makes us human. So to really get robotics to be at that level, for me, I have a concern of what that purpose is. Some Japanese, for example, say that because of our aging society, that perhaps we need robotics to take care of our elderly. But it's always that point where what's that end goal? And it's very difficult depending on what the application is and how you focus that. And if I may, one of the concerns was that in 2010, I think there was too much concern in humanoid-like robots. But when we had the Fukushima nuclear accident, it was actually kind of embarrassing that none of the robotic technology could be used, the domestic robotic technology could not be used to actually go into the nuclear plants, and that we had to rely on foreign robotic technologies. So, the government took a re-emphasis on what the mission and what the overall goal of what robotics was ultimately going to become.
That is an interesting question, isn't it, Mr. Yu? Of course, you are developing robots here in China, but let me ask you, what is your goal? Because let me give you just an example before you provide your answer. We heard about Jaja, and of course the team developing her suggesting, or it developing it, I should say, suggesting that it's not likely to sell, not likely to put into commercialization either. It's just one robot they want to continue to develop with the new latest technology. We also heard similar thing like a Xian who is like a monk, humanoid monk robot in a temple in Beijing. Many of those graduated from Tsinghua University were working as monks also in that temple. They developed this one. He can preach, he can interact, and he will say, I will ask my master. But what is the goal of that eventually? The team also said, we don't want to reproduce it We just want to experiment it with it. So what is the end game? What is the end of the tunnel, Mr. Yu?
Yeah, certainly. So one thing I would like to point out is making human-like a robot is just a small part of the broad area of what we call robotics. So robotics means making automatic machines, which can perform some jobs.
Right.
Not necessarily human-like. Right. So I think, of course, people are very curious if we can reproduce ourselves. It's some kind of philosophical thinking rather than functional in terms of functionalities.
Interesting that Mr. Saito earlier was talking about entertaining, and you're talking about philosophical. So let me go to you, Mr. Gong. What is the use and the function of these kind of humanoid robots? It's just something that we want to have fun with. We're just fascinated about something that may look like us. What's going to be its function?
So humanoid robot definitely is very interesting subfield of robotics. And there was a lot of emphasis on developing humanoid robot because they have very similar body shape as human beings. That being said, a lot of equipments which was originally designed for human use now can directly be used as by a robot which has a human shape as well. So we can see, for example, in urban search and rescue missions, these robots can directly be used, operate human device to save people from big disasters. And also we can see in a crowded environment, we would love to have a robot of body shape or morphology very similar to human beings, so we can have more natural and smooth interaction with these machines.
But you know, Mr. Yu, I have to say some of the experiments, at least going on here in China, were not necessarily very successful. As Mr. Saito was also talking about earlier with the experiences of the earthquake inside his country.
Right.
At several restaurants, just to attract the customers, they
Right.
begin to use a humanoid robot. But eventually, some of these robots cannot perform some specific task. For example, putting hot soup onto
Right.
the table.
Right.
And they cannot take order,
Right.
cannot fill in water, and
Right.
sometimes would have clashes with
Right.
human beings.
Right.
So what exactly is going to be the goal of this? Can it really fulfill its goal?
Yeah, I think the objective of robotics is to make intelligent machines can perform jobs under uncertainties. It's not like in a standard conditions, in a follow standard precision. That's usual machine. It's not robotics.
Right.
So
you're talking about repetitions. That's
Exactly.
for the robots, not necessarily humanoid robot, right?
Well, it's like machines, regular machines,
indeed.
traditional machines, not like robots. We want the robots as intelligent enough to perform jobs under uncertainties. Let's say we don't know the layout of a restaurant. Let's say even layout of a restaurant can be changing constantly, and even you are facing different customers, right? So the job of the robots can adjust its behaviors or actions in different situations, right?
One of the team members developing Jaja was suggesting the next stage of task for them. They are talking about deep learning capabilities,
Yeah.
meaning that she or it itself needs to learn on its own some of the important knowledges and skills rather than just human push all of these knowledges and install it, and therefore he or she can function. And also talking about more interactions, Mr. Yu,
Right.
with the human being. But how long a process are we talking about here? Which is very much related to what you said earlier, the
Right.
end goal of the humanoid robot.
Right. I think in the past 10 years, artificial intelligence has made a significant advance, in particular in the areas what you mentioned, deep learning. The deep learning is computer algorithms that can learn from data.
Yeah.
That's like just a human being can learn from experience.
For example, AlphaGo.
Yeah.
Even though it's not a humanoid robot,
Yeah.
but it certainly has the deep learning capability.
Exactly. It's keep learning the skills, by practicing over and over and then having more and more experience. And actually the algorithm is getting smarter and smarter. So that's actually a very essential part of artificial intelligence.
Right.
Yeah.
But what about next for you, Mr. Saito? Do you think the deep learning capability can be easily come by? And what would that mean for human beings? After all we have is deep learning capabilities anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to clarify that humanoid robots is really just a form factor of all robotics, and that AI is a specific science in and to itself. Obviously, they'll merge. I think that one of the obvious benefits for having a humanoid robot that is AI capable and self-learning is that it can do it from a perspective of and the vantage point of a human being. And so, you know, because of the form factor that we are in, it provides certain limitations that other robotics may not be capable of entertaining. But I think that it's important that AI and robotics are on a separate path of renaissance, and eventually they'll come together. But it's interesting to see how they are evolving separately, and it's probably a better thing to think about them as two separate items at the moment.
Mr. Gong, what about your vision for robots, and especially humanoid robot?
So, as a researcher, I personally think there is a very tight relation between artificial intelligence and the robots. Because, at least from my personal perspective, the way we distinguish from an intelligent robot from a traditional repetitive machine is how much intelligence it is built in these robots. So, I will see in the next 5 to 10 years, with the development of artificial intelligence, a lot of robots will have better and better capability, and I will expect to see a transition of these robots being used from a more industrial, structured environment towards more flexible, more general applications. For example, being used as a personal secretary in office or butler in homes.
That sounds really fascinating. Before we go, Mr. Yu, I do want to have this important question, quote unquote, to ask you. Some say, well, with better hope that Jia could learn on her own the most important elements of style, because what she's wearing right now really is not in style at all. Is that likely to happen?
She cannot even walk.
We see hopefully more elements that is going to exist and also come into being with the humanoid robot. Thank you so much, Yu Kai, William Saito, and Gong Chaowei. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight, CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world.